I'm very happy to welcome all of you on behalf of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. The topic European Strategic Autonomy is discussed all around Europe, and with this event we would like to contribute as well, bringing together politicians and experts from Germany, France, Europe and Lithuania, and in our audience participants from even more countries. I'm very glad that I could see that we will even have people at least from all the ministries of foreign affairs of all three Baltic countries. Thank you for joining us. This shows that in cases like this, our by now experienced work in the pandemic has some good things to deliver as well, as we never would have been able to have such an event in presence, neither with our speakers nor with our guests, not for 1.30 hours. Ladies and gentlemen, just a few words about the date of the event. As you might imagine, by planning the event, we were looking for a date near the European Day of May 9th. But May 5th always was a very special day for me and for Germany. On May 5th, 1955, the so-called Paris Contracts came into force and the occupation statute was repealed. The Federal Republic of Germany got its partial sovereignty, and due to that, we became member of NATO on May 9th. The second important incident happened on May 5th, 1990. The 2+4 meeting of the foreign ministers started the start of the reunification process. So I think discussing a European topic on such a date is the best we can do, as all of us without Europe and NATO never could come together as we can do today. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish all of us an interesting discussion, and I give the floor now to Linas Kojala, our moderator for today. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Elisabeth, for organizing this fantastic event. I'm Linas Kojala, Director of Eastern Europe Studies Center here in Vilnius, Lithuania, and I'm actually joining you from a studio that we established together in close cooperation with Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, and we are so happy to be organizing this event together on a very important topic of European strategic autonomy, which is important, which is interesting, but sometimes, as a term, also a little bit confusing. So this is a great opportunity for all of us to discuss it from various perspectives, to have different opinions, and to possibly even reach some sort of consensus on how to seek a way forward. And for that, we have a wonderful group of speakers who will share their insights and possibly answer to some of the questions that the audience poses. And I will now introduce the speakers. So first of all, Mr. David McAllister, who is the chairman of the European Parliament's Committee on Foreign Affairs. We are also glad to welcome Mr. Arnoldas Pranckevičius, who is Vice Minister at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, and two wonderful experts joining us today as well. Dr. Elisabeth Pannier, she's a research fellow and head of Geopolitics of Technologies program at the French Institute of International Relations, as well as Dr. Jana Puglierin, who is head of the Berlin office and the senior policy fellow for the European Council on Foreign Relations. Some technical details before we start. I will ask each of the speakers to make short introductory remarks of around 5 to 7 minutes. Then we'll have some follow-up questions, and all of those who are joining us in the audience are encouraged to ask questions. Please use the chat option below on your Zoom screen to write a question throughout the event. So please don't wait till the very end. Ask your questions or make some short remarks via the chat box at any time during the event. Hopefully we will have enough time to address at least some of your questions and remarks at the second part of this event. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor now to Mr. David McAllister.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and special thanks, of course, go to Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for organizing this event, and I would like to greet you from the European Parliament in Brussels. Now, today we're talking about European strategic autonomy and what this all means. What I have observed in Brussels, and I guess it's the same in Berlin or in the Baltics, wherever, a number of terms are being used to essentially describe and define the need for the European Union to readjust its role in the new geopolitical world. Strategic autonomy, strategic sovereignty, open strategic autonomy, technological sovereignty, European sovereignty, just to name a few terms I just came across this weekend when I was reading and preparing for this event. So the ambiguity of the concept has obviously led to a certain degree of confusion. Now, the concept of strategic autonomy isn't new. In fact, the EU Council already used this terminology in 2013 in relation to defense industry. And after this, it was further elaborated in the 2016 EU Global Strategy with a clear reference to the EU achieving, quote, an appropriate level of strategic autonomy, unquote. However, until now, no agreement could really be reached within the EU member states on a single definition, since not all member states understand it in the same way when used in different fields. Now, today's event, we're going to limit the discussion to the foreign policy and security dimension, which remains predominant. The use of the concept is understandable given the deteriorating security landscape that the European Union has to face and the rising geopolitical rivalries. And the COVID-19 pandemic, as we all know, has aggravated existing security trends and emphasized the need for us as European Union to strengthen our power and our capacity to act in line with our values and interests, including on supply chains and technology. Now, whatever term we use, let us remember that all of them, in the end, simply describe the symptoms of the strategic challenges we are facing as EU and the need to address the vulnerabilities and dependencies. First and foremost, we need to be aware that Europe's weight in the world will shrink undoubtedly if we do not act together now. We will become irrelevant in the future. I don't have to tell you as foreign policy experts about the number of conflicts and tensions we are being confronted with at our periphery. Therefore, we need to close capability gaps, and we need to present and be active in areas where our European interests are at stake. Now, for this reason, the European Union has been creating several important building blocks for setting up a meaningful architecture in this field since 2016. These include the Permanent Structured Cooperation PESCO, the Coordinated Annual Review on Defence Card, or the European Defence Fund. I would say that we have achieved more on European security and defence cooperation since 2016. That means in the last 5 years, as perhaps in 50 years before. And now there's more to come. The Strategic Compass will be a new instrument to unite EU member states behind a common foreign policy vision and a common security and defence culture. Europeans still have differentiated risk perceptions. I always observe this attending the Foreign Affairs Ministers' Council in the so-called Gimli format. Countries in the south or the southeast have a different understanding of threats and dangers compared to the Nordic and Baltic states, who are at the forefront of cyber and hybrid threats. However, I am observing a bit more solidarity and a common strategic approach. One example, there are now French forces stationed in Estonia, just as there are Estonian special forces engaged alongside France in Mali. The exercise of the Strategic Compass aims to further develop a fully fledged concept of what we really want to achieve specifically, and which capabilities the EU should and should not provide with respect to crisis management, enhancing partnerships, and protecting our citizens. In the end, it's working towards a stronger, more autonomous, more united, and more assertive foreign and security policy here in Brussels. A final remark. I believe the European Union has a great untapped potential if all components, both hard power and soft power, are combined and integrated. High ambitions need to be underpinned by actual military means and capabilities. This cannot and won't happen overnight, but we are working on that step by step. As somebody who served in the German military forces himself 2 years ago in the Bundeswehr from 1989 to 1991, I strongly believe in NATO. NATO, and especially the coordination with our best and strongest allies outside Europe, the United States and Canada, remains an indispensable pillar for protecting our territorial integrity and for protecting our stability and freedom. So whatever we will do in Europe, and it's about having reliable capabilities for managing crisis in our own neighborhood, taking the lead internationally when it concerns our own interests, and protecting our citizens, it's always about staying transatlantic and at the same time becoming more European. Our security and defense capabilities should not be in competition with NATO, duplicate NATO capabilities, or even be against NATO. No, it's about strengthening the European pillar within NATO, and it's about strengthening cooperation between EU and NATO. And to conclude, one example, the defense ministers will tomorrow decide, or is it today or tomorrow, decide that the United States, Canada, and Norway will join the EU project military mobility. That is a good example how we can see that European cooperation in the end also can strengthen the transatlantic bond. I'll keep it there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. McAllister, for your remarks. Just maybe a quick follow-up question. You've mentioned some progress which was made over the last couple of years with PESCO and other initiatives. Do you feel strong political momentum currently in the European Parliament to proceed with other tangible steps at this moment of crisis from a political standpoint? Because usually foreign policy is obviously taken as an area of national decision-making procedures rather than necessarily an integrated policy area.
Well, the European Parliament has always been at the forefront of supporting and asking for a closer cooperation on security and defense policy. If you look at the latest reports in the European Parliament, my annual report on the Common Foreign Security Policy, but also the CSDP report presented by my colleague Sven Mikser from the Baltics. Both reports, which were adopted with a large majority in the European Parliament, show that we are in favor of the concept of a European Defence Union, a fully fledged European Defence Union. We have quoted ourselves in my annual CFSP report that the threats we are facing today should lead the European Union to develop its strategic autonomy while strengthening cooperation with its allies. And this is a good sentence, what it's all about. I want to be very clear, neither in the short term nor in the midterm will we in Europe be able to defend and protect ourselves. We are dependent, but we are not only dependent, I think we should have a strong interest in continuing the closest possible relation you can have with our best partner outside Europe, the United States.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Arnoldas Pranckevičius. Please, sir.
Thank you so much, Linas, and thank you for the invitation to Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung also to this event. And I think Mr. McAllister was extremely eloquent in describing the ambiguity of the term strategic autonomy and how sometimes it really diverts the attention from the essence of the debate to the more discussion on the vocabulary and words. I myself would probably prefer to talk about resilience, about EU's capacity to act, about its, of course, growing responsibility, both locally and globally, rather than autonomy, because the word autonomy itself has a connotation of being autonomous from somebody, and therefore here in Vilnius we always ask the question, autonomy from whom, right? And of course all of the questions that are in the EU's current challenge toolbox, they all necessitate global action. They all necessitate stronger Europe's role, but they all can be addressed only working together, collectively. It is absolutely clear that in the post-COVID-19 world, the EU needs to get its act together in terms of open strategic autonomy, right, in economic terms, in terms of rebuilding its resilience of economy, of trade, of supply chains, in terms of boosting, for instance, the vaccine manufacturing capabilities, which are now in the direct work of Commissioner Thierry Breton. It's quite clear that the EU is leading the debate on the climate change and becoming climate neutral by 2050, building the global alliance on this very important issue. It is true that also EU needs to make much more steps in terms of strengthening its digital posture in the world and building its digital single market, as well as being better equipped to compete in terms of data economy, in terms of artificial intelligence, in terms of digitalization globally. But for all of those problems, we need cooperation with the global partners of ours who share democratic human rights and rule of law principles, and who can also help us to be a bit more assertive and much stronger vis-a-vis the new trends and very disturbing trends of autocracies in Russia and China, where the collective reaction and action of both EU and United States is necessary. So therefore, when we talk about security and defense issue, Lithuania sees the necessity to approach this issue carefully and to always, as Mr. McAllister also said, remember the transatlantic link, remember, the cooperation that we have with the United States, as well as with the United Kingdom, which has left the European Union. And therefore, what High Representative Josep Borrell said is quite true. We should be able to act together whenever possible and act alone when necessary. But the stress is on the first part, that we should always look for the opportunities to be together rather than alone. And if situation requires us to be alone, then of course we need to have a much stronger capacity to act. And we are completely in favor and of course endorsing all of the EU defense and security initiatives that are benefiting to the common security, that are also very much complementary to NATO, such as PESCO, such as European Defense Fund. And in all of those initiatives, Lithuania is very active. For instance, in PESCO, it was one of the first member states to initiate the Cyber Rapid Reaction Force initiative, which is a very successful one and has been one of the most productive ones. We are also extremely enthusiastic supporters of military mobility project in the European Union, which is also in the big interest of NATO. And I completely agree with Mr. McAllister that it is very great news that our transatlantic partners and other European partners will be able to join military mobility project and therefore enhance our entire security. So we are seeing this debate rather in terms of content rather than vocabulary. And we want, first of all, to make sure that the European Union indeed works on those capabilities that are real, that are compatible and necessary, and those which are not duplicating or in many ways, for instance, competing with those of NATO. So maybe those few first impressions from my side.
Thank you, Mr. Pranckevičius. Just maybe a quick follow-up. You've already mentioned that Lithuania is a very pro-European country with strong support for higher level of European integration, is always keen to support these kind of projects. On the other hand, there is some concern that this concept might go against some of the close transatlantic relations or relations with some other partners, especially relevant in terms of foreign and security policy. Do you think there is the right balance at the moment in terms of how this is being discussed on the European level between those concerns and practical matters that you mentioned that are highly needed or highly supportive of Lithuania's own foreign policy goals and ambitions?
I believe that the balance is there, and indeed it's very important that in these issues, of course, unanimity is still prevalent. So, of course, any movement in terms of major change in security and defense will necessitate the agreement of all, and therefore this requires a very profound debate and agreement, consensus among all allies. And for the time being, I think we achieved that balance, and clearly with the arrival of Joe Biden to the White House and with the new US administration, we can feel a much different dynamic, big enthusiasm on the EU side in terms of cooperation with the new administration on all fields, from climate change to digital issues to trade to security. And therefore, we have a very good momentum indeed to strengthen transatlantic bond, as well as to strengthen European security and defense policy in dialogue and in cooperation with our American friends, which will benefit the interests of both sides of the Atlantic.
Thank you very much. We've had two speakers from the political side of the aisle, now two wonderful experts. Ms. Pannier, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be the typical French voice here. So thank you for allowing me to express some thoughts. I just want to just a quick reminder of where the concept of strategic autonomy comes from a French perspective. It dates back to the 50s and 60s, to the post-Second World War context of a country, France, that is weakened, that has to rebuild its military power, and that indeed has to build its political power again and be, if you like, politically autonomous indeed from external actors, including during the Cold War period, the US and the USSR. So it's originally a national concept. It's originally about defense and about being able to have the full spectrum of one's defense, from the industry to nuclear to military capabilities and deployments to intelligence gathering and analysis. So it is a concept that is old, that is very entrenched in French strategic thinking. It is, if you like, as entrenched as Germany's pacifism or as the Baltic countries' attachment to the Atlantic Alliance. So it is there to stay. And it is indeed, even though it is there to stay, it evolves, just like Germany's pacifism evolves, or just like the Baltic countries' foreign policies evolves and also comes to support, if you like, for example, the development of an EU security role. So you have this evolution over time, even and France's balancing act between the national and the European level of strategic autonomy is still underway. If you like, there are still some balances and some tensions that remain, if you like, unresolved. How much strategically autonomous can you be nationally and at the European level? How much can you be autonomous at the European level, all the while being, a participant and a full-fledged participant in NATO? Some of those question marks do remain. I agree with that. At the same time, if we take participation in NATO from a French perspective, it did evolve. It has evolved significantly over the past 20 years, and today France is a key contributor to the alliance in terms of budgets, in terms of military deployments within NATO, in terms as well as of contributing to NATO's political orientations. Let's remember that the current ongoing discussion within NATO for the next strategic concept was partly, for a good part, initiated by President Macron, and also French solidarity towards its allies is 100%. So that's strategic autonomy can be compatible, is compatible, fully compatible with being a member of NATO and fully invested in it. At the same time, the French view is that NATO is one security organization. It cannot be the only security organization. And I want to quote here President Macron in February of this year, 2021. I quote him, "There is no political entity which does exist which is not in charge of protecting its people." It is a very simple case of, you cannot outsource your security and defense to an external actor, even if you are politically and strategically very close to that external actor. And we were talking about Europe sort of having a measured degree of autonomy vis-a-vis the US, or autonomous from whom was the question that Arnoldas asked. But at the same time, if we think from a US perspective, the US is autonomous. The US is a strategically autonomous actor, and yet it is the Europeans' closest ally. So both can go hand in hand. But then I think from a French perspective, there is an existential dimension to strategic autonomy. It relates to what I was saying earlier. There is no political entity which can be autonomous, which is not in charge of protecting its people. You cannot be a political entity and not be in charge of that. So it is a matter of existential, of existence. It is also a matter of relevance in the sense of not being a spectator of international affairs and of your own security. So in terms of, doing something towards advancing European strategic autonomy in the current context, especially, post-pandemic, obviously from this perspective that I was, going back to the original historical concept, Europe is nowhere near the degree of autonomy that we should be striving for. And going back to what was said before, to be able to act alone when necessary, we all very well know that it's still, a question mark whether Europe would ever even be able to do that, to actually act alone when necessary. And that's a military question, and obviously gaps should be filled, and gaps should be filled in coordination with NATO so as to avoid duplications, and this we all agree on that. But at the same time, down the line, I think it's a matter of political awakening. And because France has such a strong, and demanding view of strategic autonomy and such an existential view of strategic autonomy, it does feel increasingly isolated because, actually the EU is probably at this point France's best partner in this battle. But so France is feeling isolated because, especially in the context of post-pandemic potentially lowering defense budgets and the new Biden administration being seen as a relief and sort of relieving the Europeans of the task of having to indeed build their strategic autonomy, France is feeling increasingly isolated. But I think, even if these views are not shared by everyone, the most demanding views, there is value in having someone wave the red flag, and someone saying, you guys have to wake up. I think, aside from the historical perspective of where the concept is coming from in the French context, I think it's also important to understand that the diagnostic that French authorities have is maybe different from the diagnostic of other countries, or at least they are facing it more, heads on. The diagnostic is that Trump is not a historical accident, and Trump represents a strong tendency in the US of isolationism, and there is a trend of gradual disengagement of the US from Europe and from the European neighborhood, and that will likely be durable. And the French concern is especially with the Middle East and Africa, which is increasingly unstable and contested, but also with regards to Russia, and France is engaged alongside its allies, as part of EFP, and this will only, worsen as indeed defense budgets may lower, and as the political momentum for strategic autonomy may weaken, and arguably, and that David McAllister made a point about that the need for strategic autonomy is even greater now post-pandemic. and that the pandemic plus China's growing rise and assertiveness have confirmed the need for more European strategic autonomy and have broadened its scope to include non-traditional security and defense concerns, including technological sovereignty, in addition to a more militarily capable union. So as a final word, I would say that the US is moving forward at full speed in preparation for peer competition with China. And for winning the technological race. The US will not wait for Europe. They will not wait for Europeans' contributions. They will do whatever they think is right, is in their own interest. They are an autonomous entity, and we may indeed work with the US as much as possible, and we should, but we cannot just take a back seat and wait for an external actor to determine what is in the Europeans' interest. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Quick follow-up question. You've mentioned the long tradition of discussing or thinking about the issues related to strategic autonomy in France, and also obviously President Macron is very outspoken in discussing practicalities of today and future possibilities. Do you see any possibility for that playing an important role in terms of the coming presidential election? I mean, whether strategic autonomy could be an important aspect in domestic politics of France in coming months as well?
That's a great question. I think in terms of the foreign policy of France, those aspects that tend to be the most debated, or where the lines divide in the French political spectrum, are with regards to, indeed, the approach towards the US is one, the approach towards Russia. The approach towards China will now become an increasingly, point of discussion, I guess. And in a way, indeed, the purpose of strategic autonomy, or more generally sovereignty, it is one that is shared, I think, across the political spectrum. And I think, especially as the main debate in 2017 in the last election was between globalism and sovereignism or localism. And I think now, with the pandemic and the rise of China and everything we've said about technological sovereignty, I think increasingly that debate will no longer be there is no longer going to be such an opposition between sovereignism and globalism, as Macron used to represent globalism and Marine Le Pen represented sovereignism. I don't think that's going to be the case anymore, because in the end, the strategic landscape has changed, and even those who were the most, so to speak, globalist now want to have put an increasing emphasis on the need for, indeed, resiliency and sort of sovereign control over technologies and the digital realm, for example. I mean, sovereign, you understand what I mean.
Thank you very much. Ms. Puglierin, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to Elisabeth Bauer for including me in this debate, which I enjoyed very much up to this point personally, but I'm really questioning myself, and for a long time now, whether this debate, the one we are having today, and the broader debate about strategic autonomy is at all helpful, or whether it's just a nice way to keep us think tankers occupied and to kind of to avoid to talk about what's really important. And to a certain extent, I totally agree with what Mr. Pranckevičius has said. I think it's a way of distraction. Strategic autonomy has become a buzzword, and it has so much polarized the debate so far under the Trump administration. But I think even to this day, kind of this very term autonomy, I know so many kind of friends who are Democrats in the United States who hate that word. So I think it has brought kind of some poison into the transatlantic relationship just by mentioning it, and also within the European Union. I think we spent way too much talking about an abstract concept, kind of philosophical questions, than about concrete action. And I think sometimes, or at least I get the impression, that the debate has become an end in itself. It's a debate about a debate. and it's not about substance. So we actually fake political action. And I think that is very dangerous, because all these big words about the EU becoming strategically autonomous kind of really widen the gap between kind of the words and the deeds, and widen in that sense also the EU's credibility, because we cannot live up to what we promise or what we will achieve. I think you've seen kind of how useless this debate really is between, when there was this fight between our defense minister in Germany, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, and Emmanuel Macron. So they had this kind of, I think, very stupid fight over kind of the 5 to 10% where they disagree, or maybe it was just one aspect where they disagreed, and not on kind of, they did not kind of talk constructively about the 90% that unites them. So both have said numerous times that they want to focus on the EU's capacity to act, that both want the EU to become a player and not a plaything, both want the EU to become more resilient. So I think there is so much common ground, so why waste all this time? I think this whole debate about strategic autonomy in reality is a debate about the United States and Europe and our relationship. Although strategic autonomy, the term goes back a long time, and also in the EU discourse was introduced or used before Trump was elected. I think only after the election of Donald Trump, it became a real thing. And so from a German perspective, I think it's really, that is also kind of, I think, where the kind of the fight between AKK and Macron stemmed from, kind of this idea, and many in Germany share this idea, that France basically says too easily goodbye to the transatlantic relationship by proclaiming that NATO is brain dead, and by giving up basically, or by sometimes in Germany there was this feeling that kind of the election of Donald Trump was seen as a positive thing to a certain extent in Paris, although of course not publicly admitted, but it was really emphasizing everything that the French always thought about the Americans. Kind of it was a present to boost the strategic autonomy debate. So that's how it was perceived in Berlin. And the thing is, seen from Berlin, NATO is not just one organization in Europe that deals with security issues or defense issues, but it's the backbone of Germany's security. And there is actually, I don't see any political will to reorganize this currently. So of course, Germans always emphasize the EU as a growing actor. They want to build the EU's defense union. But I would argue that there is a lot of emphasis on the union and not so much on the defense aspect, kind of keeping the club together, building structures, institutions. I agree that much has been achieved. David McAllister has said this. But I always wonder, how does that, what has been achieved, change the calculus of our competitors out there? Does anybody, I don't know, in Russia or in China is now more scared of the European Union because of the PESCO project? I doubt this. And so the fundamental difference, I think, between Germany and France here is that when Elisa talks about, France's ambition that the EU needs to take care of its own security and cannot outsource this, I think Germany is quite comfortable with outsourcing many of its own security and defense. That's a bit provocative. That's not how I like it to be, but I think that's the reality. And also, because of our constitution, we really think in terms of institutions. So we think NATO, we think European Union, and unlike France, we don't think, let's cooperate with European partners in a coalition of the willing and take care of things. So this is not how Germany can think of defense, and that's why NATO remains so important. The German perspective sometimes on the debate in Central and Eastern Europe is that debate is too much focused on the dependency on the US, and kind of that there is too little openness to really engage in the European dimension and join kind of attempts to make the EU more autonomous or more capable of acting. The Germans in general, I think, they don't like to talk about strategic autonomy much. They prefer very much European sovereignty because they like to broaden the scope and take it beyond the policy area of security and defense. And autonomy is about becoming kind of independent from partners, and sovereignty is seen as lowering dependence in the economic and technical sphere. So, but interestingly, that's the opposite in France. I've learned from a recent study. So there is this, I think, consensus that has emerged on strategic autonomy in Germany, and that's also the consensus that we all have agreed on here. So it's basically, we want to have it both ways. We want to be more capable of acting, and we want to be a good partner to the United States. And it's like in a marriage, we say, kind of the moment we take more care of ourselves, we become more attractive and more independent, the more we become also an attractive partner. And I think that is true to a certain extent, but, and that is my last point, I think we have to be very clear that we want to pursue two goals at once. We want to become less dependent and more capable of joining basically alliances or the transatlantic alliance. And there is a certain tension in there. And I mean, it's nice to say, yeah, that's basically, we do one thing and we reach two goals. But I mean, there are these trade-offs, as we have very clearly seen with the discussion on third-party participation in the European Defence Fund. So more strategic autonomy is necessarily about becoming more self-reliant and more independent. But actually the willingness to interconnect and to become dependent on somebody else is the base for a working partnership. So I think it's really a question of finding the right balance. How much do we want to do on our own, and how much can we afford to rely on others, especially for such a crucial thing as our security? And I think we have to acknowledge that there are tensions, and we cannot paper them over, so we have to address them. So how much strategic autonomy do we want in the industrial and kind of technological field? Are we competitors with the United States there? And so maybe to end with some concrete ideas, how to make this work better, or how to maybe find the right balance. The US request to join the PESCO project was already mentioned. I think this is a great chance for the EU and needs to make that work. But I think there are other things. I think the EU really kind of, in order to become that more credible actor, needs to show that it's not about subsidizing European defense companies, but about kind of making a credible investment and actually producing something that is then also helpful in NATO. I think we need to talk about what does this European pillar in NATO really mean, and how does this align with what we do in the EU. I think we need to define the partnership approach we have in the European Union. We have strategic partners all around, but kind of if we rank that better, where is the US and what are special partnership privileges? And I think we need to take some burden from the United States. That means we need to become more capable to serve as a backbone of conventional deterrence in Europe. And I have heard this in this discussion again. Europe cannot defend itself. We are dependent on the United States for the foreseeable future, and that might all be true, but I think that cannot be an endpoint of the discussion. That cannot be kind of an argument to end the debate. That needs to be the beginning of a debate where we ask ourselves, like, is this forever? Is there any way to change this? Do we want to change this? And how do we maybe reach a point where this is not a fact any longer, if Alice is right and the US is slowly departing from Europe? And with that, I end.
Thank you. A follow-up question for you, if I may. You mentioned that this discussion may be used as a way to disguise lack of consensus on many geopolitical dilemmas. So how would you evaluate, from your perspective, the progress that EU has made over the last, say, 7 years since Crimea's annexation, in at least trying to make some steps forward towards a more unified position, towards a stronger position on a European or international theater related to many foreign policy issues? Do you see any tangible, sustainable, and notable steps made over the last years?
I mean, I could give you an easy answer and just refer to SofaGate and Borrell's performance in Moscow and then end it here. But I think that's not true. I think on China, we've seen tremendous progress in aligning European perspectives. We've seen this with the investment agreement. I'm not a personal fan of this agreement, but one needs to acknowledge that it was an agreement, it was kind of a joint European position on China. I think we have seen progress. I think it is still remarkable after how the EU came together after 2014, and there are all these outliers, and I know how difficult it is. So I think but I think both is true. I mean, there is Borrell's performance in Moscow, and there is progress. But and I think we cannot judge the EU only by where does the kind of who sits where, but of course all this weakens the credibility of the European Union in the world tremendously. And but there has been progress. I don't want to be so negative.
Thank you very much. So we've had introductory remarks by all of the speakers. If any one of you would like to react or jump in with some short statements in reaction to what your colleagues have mentioned, just please indicate that to me. I'm always willing to give you that opportunity. And I also see some questions already written in the chat box, and I encourage others who think about them also to do not hesitate, basically, and then please share your thoughts. And before we go on to those questions, maybe one general question for all of you. And again, please indicate who would like to respond. The Chinese deal was mentioned, the Chinese investment deal with the European Union was mentioned, and it also could be discussed as a way of ensuring European strategic autonomy if the EU does not engage in such deal, because it obviously makes their cooperation more strong. But on the other hand, the strategic autonomy could mean that EU has less leverage on its partners, including China, but not necessarily only China. So basically, if the EU cuts some of its ties, if it tries to be more independent or more autonomous in some areas of policy, then it could have less leverage on countries which it wants to have some leverage on. So is there a way to tackle this dilemma? Is there a way to reach a consensus on what does leverage mean and what does autonomy mean in different circumstances? Any one of the speakers would like to share some thoughts on? Yeah, please, Ms. Pannier, and then Arnoldas.
Yeah, I just to react on your very last point, I don't think there is anyone calling for cutting ties. I think even the French are just not calling for that at all. I think it's just it's a matter of growing Europeans' contribution as part of NATO, and I think not everything has to go through EU. So I think going back to what Jana was saying earlier, indeed, some of it will go through a European EU effort. Others will go through more coordinated coalitions of the willing, or even working with partners outside of the EU, not necessarily always within a NATO framework. I don't think it's about cutting ties. I think it's to me, it's merely about having the capacity to make your own strategically informed decision, and even just again from a political angle, just having the capacity to have your information and analyze it and decide what you want to do based on that information. So I just wanted to react to this, and it happens firstly at the state level, because that's where the military capabilities are, the defense budgets are.
Thank you, Mr. Pranckevičius.
Thank you, Lina. I think, you mentioned an area, a policy area, which is exactly showing us how much the EU's capacity to engage is important. Trade is one of those areas where the European Union undoubtedly is a superpower, a global power, a number one trading partner for more than 70 economies in the world. And therefore, its ability to have a contractual relationship to do those trade deals globally is one of its best examples of exerting not only soft power, but also in terms of strengthening the global trade system, in terms of strengthening the rules in the trade system, in terms of ensuring reciprocity, in our relationships in terms of ensuring the safety and transparency of our investments. So I think, these were also the, the underlying reasons why for 7 years, the negotiations with China were conducted on the bilateral investment agreement. But, the timing of conclusion and indeed now the timing of ratification couldn't be worse. And as I understand, the Commission has suspended the procedure. Probably Mr. McAllister will be able to comment in a very detailed way, how European Parliament has reacted also, to the Chinese sanctions against quite a few MEPs, also those who work in the Human Rights Subcommittee. So clearly at the moment, it is not feasible to see any quick ratification, but it also shows how even the ratification becomes a tool of foreign policy of the European Union to show its principles, to show its respect for human rights and rule of law, and indeed to play the hard ball with China. But overall, this instrument is an instrument of engagement. We are strong when we try to commit others to subscribe to common commitments, whether that would be trade, climate, or indeed security.
Thank you. Mr. McAllister, you probably wanted to react.
Yeah, just a quick remark from my side. One observation, all EU member states, all 27, agree that the European Union has to be more geopolitical. Ursula von der Leyen herself has named her commission geopolitical, and we all agree that we have to be a better global player, we have to be stronger, more united, and more effective. And all of us mention trade policy as the leading example. When it comes to trade, the European Union is a superpower. We are at eye level with all other countries in the world. But what we're seeing in the moment is not only a discussion about how we can improve our foreign security and defense policy, we're also weakening our trade policy. I would like to ask you, what have we achieved in recent years on trade after the very successful trade agreements with Japan, YEFTA, and CETA Canada? Where are we in this term? Mercosur is going nowhere. After 20 years of painstaking negotiations, now obviously there are a number of member states who are not willing to conclude. Are we anywhere near starting serious trade negotiations with India? No. Australia and New Zealand, are we going to move forward? Who knows? So on the one hand, we are always using trade as an example. On the other hand, we're not really moving forward at the moment. And now on China. I used to say there are 3 C's to deal with China. Now I would say there are 4 English C's to deal with China. We need to confront China. We need to contain China. But we also need to cooperate with China, and we need to compete with China. Who believes that we can achieve our climate targets, our global climate targets, without cooperating with China? We will have to. And when it comes to competition, we need to know that if we want it or not, China is a very, very important market for European companies. And I come from a country, Germany, where a lot of companies are in a very fierce competition on the Chinese market. And I think we also have a responsibility for our companies who are operating in fierce competition with Chinese companies. That's why, in general, I would say the comprehensive agreement on China could be one aspect of EU-China relations. It's not the silver bullet to solve all our problems. How could it be? But it was one pillar. And Ms. Puglierin knows what I'm going to argue now, because we've had a clash once before at a debate in Frankfurt. I still believe that it was a wise move of the German government, of Chancellor Merkel, my chancellor, to try and get this through. Now, what's going to happen now? Well, in the moment, we're still waiting for the legal scrubbing of the text, and it needs to be translated in all 24 languages. But whether it will actually be ratified by member states in the European Parliament or not remains to be seen. But why I took the floor was that there was some irritation about an interview my good friend Valdis Dombrovskis gave, but this has now been clarified. Let me just read out what I write on Twitter. His spokesperson says, to be clear, this is not a formal suspension decision. It just means there's no political outreach right now to promote the agreement. That's the end. That's really the quote of Valdis Dombrovskis. And indeed, I mean, it was a very, very stupid thing of the Chinese to sanction key players in the European Parliament, like the chairman of the EU-China delegation or the EPP spokesperson, Michael Gala, the subcommittee on human rights or the whole PSC. As long as these decisions have been taken, I simply do not know how we can organize any kind of majorities in the European Parliament for an agreement which, once again, I would say in general could be one part of our future EU-China policy.
Thank you. Dr. Puglierin, you were mentioned. Maybe you would like to jump in.
We had this discussion back in Frankfurt where I was basically arguing that I think the timing was completely wrong. I thought it was wrong from also my chancellor to push this through against what I had understood also the will of some other member states and to impose this basically. That's the reaction I got from smaller member states, not all of them, but some of them. And yeah, I thought that it was politically the wrong signal to the incoming Biden administration. I would have preferred to talk to them before, but we had this, but it's not that I cannot see Mr. McAllister's argument, and that it's also a fine line how much you need to coordinate with the United States and how much you also need to make sure that you as an EU can take your own position. But maybe if I have the floor, I could answer Niklas Helvig's question in the chat, if that's okay, or
Sure, please.
Yeah. Because this gives me also an opportunity. I was bashing my own profession, the think tankers that write so much about strategic autonomy. I mean, they write good stuff. It's interesting to read. It's thought-provoking. And Niklas Helvig from FIA is amongst those who have just published a big report on strategic autonomy, and I encourage you all to read it. And Niklas in the chat has asked about the Greens and Germany's repositioning after the German election. And I think this is a topic I'm very passionate about, so that I was so keen to answer that question, because I'm thinking about this a lot these days with, I just listened to Annalena Baerbock, who is the candidate for chancellor from the Green Party a few days ago when she gave a big interview on foreign and security policy. And I still try to wrap my head around kind of the Green position, because I think it's not easy to understand. So in general, I would say that German, especially security and defense policy, is very much guided by continuity. So the Germans are not revolutionary powers usually, and on security and defense, kind of this commitment to NATO, this commitment also to the European Union, all this is deeply ingrained in our DNA, and I think also in the Green DNA. I would still argue that a Green chancellor, and there is this possibility, but it's way too early to say something about it. It can also very well be that Armin Laschet kind of leads the polls in a couple of weeks. But let's say a Green, the Green input into a new government could be much more sympathy for President Macron overall. I mean, the Germans would always say that there is a lot of sympathy for President Macron all over, but I think the Greens are especially sympathetic on many areas. They have a huge sympathy for this idea of European sovereignty more broadly, going beyond security and defense. The Greens have a much bigger commitment to NATO than previously, but at least the leadership. So they always say that there should be no doubt about their commitment to the United States and the transatlantic alliance. However, I mean, this comes with a grain of salt. They are strongly in favor of more EU defense, but they are not willing to spend more money. And especially with the French, there are some problems when it comes to EU defense, because we have different, the Greens especially, have different ideas when jointly developed arms should where and when to export them. About, for example, questions like, new technologies, autonomous weapons. That is a question for FCAS now. The Greens have a very limited room for maneuver when it comes to military missions. They rule out coalitions of the willing, like Takuba, like Barkhane, like the Strait of Hormuz French-led mission. That is all out of the question. So I think we would maybe see a slight reorientation in Germany, maybe a stronger stance, at least rhetorically, from the Greens on Russia and China. But my fear is that this is not backed up by this commitment to defense spending, and I'm not convinced there on the military side of things still.
Can I just come in there for a moment?
Of course.
I would just like to echo what Ms. Puglierin just said. And I would also like to warn, as regards too much enthusiasm outside Germany about the prospect of our country becoming a green chancellor. The German Greens are good at public relations. Yes, they know exactly how to sell their politicians and their products. And they know exactly which buzzwords resonate, not only in the German public, but also at an international level. But I want to be very clear, as somebody who has dealt with Greens politically for 25 years, the German Greens are still the Greens. And on military and security policy, the Green left wing is still going strong. And if you have a look at the Green election platform, if you actually make the effort to read what the Greens want, you will see, for instance, that the Greens clearly oppose the 2% defense spending goal Germany is committed to within NATO. And the Greens actually have determined this goal as arbitrary. So this party does not commit to securely funding German armed forces. And that's why, as Ms. Puglierin underlined, we would be facing new challenges in European defense and security policy with a Green-led government in Germany. And I think people in the Baltics need to be very aware of this.
Thank you very much. And I would like to continue on the same trend and allow other people to jump in with their reactions, because one of the questions is related to what was mentioned just recently. It is generally felt that European strategic autonomy must go hand in hand with more burden sharing across the Atlantic Ocean. What does this mean concretely? What should be done at a short notice? And it's a question by Dr. Peter Bushman. Maybe anyone would like to jump in and discuss the criteria on how to look at the cooperation as well as contributions. Yeah, please, Ms. Puglierin.
I just start. I think the others can add, but I think burden now we have the opportunity with a new strategic concept, the process that will be initiated in NATO, and the strategic compass exercise to really discuss burden sharing again and in a new light. I think we really need to be well aware that the focus of the United States will be on the Indo-Pacific, and that the Americans, and I agree that we are dependent security-wise on them, look at us in terms of, are we an asset or a liability? And I think we have to make sure that we are not a liability. That means that we need to invest in capabilities more than we've previously done, and not only through PESCO projects, because most PESCO projects actually don't address the capability shortfalls in Europe. So I think it's really a question of more capabilities, but then also readiness. I really think that the Europeans need to prepare to contribute more to deterrence. I mean, the nuclear part, not but the conventional part. I think that the Germans and others need to become really the backbone of conventional defense in NATO. Not overnight, and I know that this is a long process, but this is why the 2% are so important, because I mean, Germany has committed to contributing capabilities and personnel to NATO, and in order to be able to do this needs to be financed. So I think this is one very crucial aspect. And then I think it's also a discussion in NATO what we can do together on China, but I see the Europeans militarily less engaged there and more in their own kind of backyard. And I think this is kind of, it's about work share. That would be kind of the start of, I think, a better transatlantic relationship.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Pannier.
Yeah, I think, we somehow have to go a little bit past the 2% hammer, and even though the commitments made in Wales must remain and must be fulfilled, including in particular, the 20% focus on capabilities and investments. That's really, really important. It's really a long-term effort, right? So it's not the good time to sort of waver, not because in the short term we have a feeling that many more countries, including France, have reached already the 2% just because the GDP has lowered, as a consequence of the pandemic. So that the fact that France has already reached the 2%, even by accident, is an indication of why a measure like that is not necessarily sufficient. Also, we need to find a way to take into account a country's actual commitment to the activities of the alliance beyond the numbers, or if it spends only on capabilities that it doesn't use or doesn't mobilize as part of the alliance, that's a problem. So that needs to be an ongoing conversation, and we need to broaden maybe the scope as well, going back to our conversation about, technological sovereignty or these kind of things, or how the concept of security is changing to cover cyber, but also even economic security. There are so many other ways that you can contribute to the collective security through the health of your infrastructure, of your cyber security, etc. So this has to be included in the thinking. It can't be solely focused on military capabilities, even though the commitments made in Wales have to remain. I think when it comes to work share, it is such a difficult question, because it would make so much sense in the first place, to think, oh, why don't Europeans focus on, the neighborhood and Russia, and then the US and other, NATO partners will focus on the Indo-Pacific theater. And I think, I think it wouldn't help reaching the level of strategic understanding that is necessary, that I was mentioning in my earlier comments, which is needed for any country to have a foreign policy that is based on its interests and values. If we limit artificially the types of security issues that Europeans have to deal with, because in fact, indeed, you may not want to engage in the Indo-Pacific, but the Indo-Pacific is coming to you, whether through trade routes and maritime routes, or through, greater Chinese footprint in the Balkans and, what have you. So you can't really separate, issue areas, even though it would make sense. Why don't just the Southern Europeans take care of the Middle East and North Africa, et cetera, et cetera. We know that Russia is there in Africa, and that, it's, so everything is interdependent, which is why work share is, unfortunately, I don't think it's practical. So I think it's a matter of almost case by case, but also capabilities. Who can go to the Indo-Pacific? Basically, the UK, France, maybe a little bit of German frigates. No German frigates. Maybe just some naval officers on French boats. But so yeah, so
we send a ship now. We are very proud that we managed to do this.
But it's a matter of upholding international law, of securing maritime routes, and I think everyone can agree on that. And I think we also have to remember some successes, like the Horn of Africa. Strong interest on both EU, NATO, and all the participating states of having those routes secured. Great example of one organization taking over the other after the end of the mandate. So I think we have some examples like that of arrangements that can be made just in good intelligence, as we say in French. That is to say, just what makes sense, what is necessary, who can do what, and not it shouldn't be systematically a matter of institutional rivalries or things that are unhelpful.
Thank you. Anyone else willing to jump in on this? If not, I see one question specifically referred to Mr. Pranckevičius. Do you think that the strategic compass is a useful tool to clarify the concept of the strategic autonomy?
Well, I do think it is a very useful tool in general to become a bit more strategic. And to have a debate about it, and we definitely welcome this initiative of the German presidency, and now, of course, very much formulated by the European External Action Service and High Representative Borrell. And if you look at those four baskets of the strategic compass, they don't talk about autonomy as such. They talk about real things. They talk about capability development, which we have just discussed, and we see clearly the limited capacity there. It talks about resilience, which I think we all agree is very necessary to reinforce. It talks about crisis management, where EU has a lot of experience, but of course, there is a lot of improvement as well. And it talks about partnerships, the fourth basket, which is very important for us in the Baltic, and I'm sure not only in the Baltic region, where we need to make sure that those partnerships are strong with the United States, with the UK, with the Eastern partners as well, if we deal with the security issues here on the Eastern flank. And overall, I think we should be realistic rather than romantic. Another question I see in the chat, is talking about financial resources, substantial additional resources that would necessitate, this ambition of strategic autonomy. And exactly, this is the real debate. European Parliament has just adopted, I think last week, a European Defense Fund's budget, right? 7.9 billion euros. It's a lot, but it isn't, right? We all wanted a bit more. This was the result of the negotiation also of the EU heads of state and government. Let's be realistic. That's extremely important first step in terms of boosting common expenditure, in terms of research and development in the area of defense. But it is not enough for the EU to pretend to be a military player and a military power. We've seen in Ukraine just recently with the massing of the Russian forces across the border that only the common reaction of both the United States and European Union actually was a good way to deter possible action of Putin's Russia. And there are many, many other examples where we alone, especially in terms of military and defense, simply wouldn't be able to act and react the way we could and we do together with the United States and together with NATO.
Thank you. Anyone else willing on the resources? A question by Ambassador Arnoldas. Yeah, please, Mr. McAllister.
Just one comment, because the European Parliament was addressed. You all know the wonderful English term to make sunshine speeches. In the German language, sunshine speeches is translated into Sonntagsreden, which is Sunday speeches. But whether you call it sunshine speeches or in German Sunday speeches, perhaps when it comes to the next multi-annual financial framework after 2027, the national governments might try to compare what they talk on Sundays and what they decide on Mondays, because the funding for projects to really drive a closer European cooperation on defense and security, which I guess we all agree is necessary, and that was what today's event of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung was about, of course, also needs a real financial funding. And we are far away from the original expectations the European Parliament had formulated. And I would like to agree with Ms. Puglierin on one point too. We have a couple of few dozen PESCO projects now, but still, from my point of view, they're not specific enough, and they still aren't really showing where the additional European added value actually is. So I think we have to scrutinize much more closely what at the moment is being sold to the European public as a closer European cooperation on security and defense.
Thank you. Anyone else on this? Yeah, Ms. Puglierin.
Maybe just also on the strategic compass, because I think if we manage this process successfully, this would really be a huge step forward, because first of all, because the member states agreed on a joint threat perception. I mean, there is no ranking, there is no prioritization, because I think that would have been too difficult, but at least there is this acknowledgement that these threats exist. And I think that is a good step. And so exactly like Arnoldas has said, the debate is now in the baskets about very concrete things, and people working on this. I joined some workshops that were organized, and they always emphasize that they want to be concrete, and they don't want lofty concepts, but they want concrete proposals. And I think it is a chance maybe to really find some working compromise on such questions like what role should the EU play in territorial defense? I mean, not replacing NATO, but when it comes to hybrid attacks or cyber attacks, or how could basically capability development in the EU also help with territorial defense? So to address this, and as I said, this simultaneous process going on in NATO, this reflection process, I mean, there's always hope. When it comes to NATO and EU relations, it can only get better. I mean, we have kind of 72 points that we agreed on. I think this in itself shows how bad the relationship is, because you don't have 72 priorities if things work well. But I think here's to hope. And so I think to really look into the hybrid file and look kind of what can be done in NATO, what can be done in the EU, how could both organizations work more closely together, and then also having maybe constructive ideas like the Center of Excellence in Helsinki, which is actually an EU-NATO cooperation, not institutionalized and formalized in one of the organizations, but I see hope here, and I think the strategic compass is a good exercise if we don't end up with the lowest common denominator. And yeah.
I think, yeah, Ms. Pannier.
Sorry, thank you. I just heard Jana said she has hope, and I was just going to say something a little bit of a warning. I am concerned that indeed, we're just going through this phase again of EU and NATO doing two things in parallel, and that in the end it will be similar but different. The European Strategic Compass and the new NATO strategic concept. And I think we're going through, if we're going to go through, if we're not already there, a phase of a new duplication debate, but reversed, where NATO is expanding its NATO is also adapting to the changing security environment in the same way as the EU is somehow, and organizations have this tendency of expanding their their scope, and NATO is quite logically trying to tackle non-strictly military threats, right? So, and that includes, again, discussions about infrastructure, cyber security, quite obviously, as well as, but also, investment screenings and things like that. And I'm really concerned that it just is going to be an unhelpful situation because first the EU was accused, so to speak, of developing defense, which was already in the basket of NATO, but now NATO is seeking to acquire new competences in areas that the EU has developed competences in the past few years, and that it's just going to worsen the tensions between the two organizations, which at this point I think are not cooperating very, very smoothly. So I am indeed very concerned with that. I did want to make another point, but I forgot, so I'll stop here.
Thank you. We have a bit less than 10 minutes left and one more question. So I would like to ask all of the speakers to use this opportunity to address the last question and to also make some concluding remarks in the opposite direction in terms of the speaker order. So the question is on, again, obviously the strategic autonomy, but as it is discussed in terms of relationship of EU and US, it seems to focus on the issue of autonomy, being autonomous with big data, security, and other issues. But when it's discussed in terms of China or Russia, the language sometimes is the opposite. We don't need autonomy, we need closer cooperation. So is that approach, or is this analysis correct? So please, Ms. Puglierin, then Ms. Pannier, Mr. Pranckevičius, and Mr. McAllister. Yeah, please, Ms. Puglierin.
I think there is a certain charm in the question. I think it addresses a crucial point, but still, that's maybe why I like the term European sovereignty better, because this is more. I think there is no difference in a way we talk vis-a-vis China or the United States, because this is more on what does the EU or what do we want to achieve in a European framework. But yeah, so I think because on substance, I don't see that difference. Maybe because it's kind of completely taken for granted that we closely align with the United States, and maybe because China and Russia, I mean, there's this natural German instinct to always kind of emphasize that these are not adversaries, but that we need to keep working with them. And this is also true when it comes to dealing with the big global challenges. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Pannier.
Thank you. That's the point I wanted to make now. So I think the fact that strategic autonomy is understood in the context or used in the context of the US, I think it's a consequence of history. I don't think I don't think the concept in itself begs for being used in that specific transatlantic context. If you take sovereignty to be a synonym of strategic autonomy, which eventually, it is that you are the decision maker for your own destiny, and you have the means to make those decisions and implement them by yourself. It doesn't matter, vis-a-vis whom those decisions are made. So I don't see. So I think the fact that we understand it in this particular context is because of the old NATO debate, and and the French view, but I don't think it's to do with the concept itself. However, I don't necessarily agree, or I personally would disagree with the underlying assumption that is, we want to be more autonomous from the US and at the same time create new dependencies on Russia and China. I think that's not at all what we're supposed to be doing, or at least that's not how I would view it at all. I think indeed we should not create new energy dependencies on countries that are as disrespectful of international law or human rights as Russia and China. I think that's not the goal. I think there is a degree of interdependency because of a globalized economy, and we just live on one planet and we have one climate. So there is interdependence that is there, but it shouldn't be asymmetrical dependency, whether it's on Russia, on China, or even on the US, because we saw what happened during the Trump presidency and the fear that was in Europe about the upcoming US election last fall, that we cannot be in that situation where our collective, destiny depends on the election in one other country, however close we are politically to that country. So I think, I think I've said what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Mr. Pranckevičius.
Thank you, and thank you for this great debate indeed. Well, I think, one of probably the ideas of this geopolitical commission of Ursula von der Leyen was also to strike the right balance between Europe being both open and, defensive of its own interests, and to become much more assertive in global affairs. And I think we are becoming, slowly but surely, at the same time remaining open and remaining engaging where it's necessary. And here I would definitely not make a equalizing mark between US on the one hand and Russia and China on the other. These are very different partners. Yes, we might and we will have disagreements with the United States. There will be legitimate interests that the EU will have to defend, but let's not be distracted. There is much more fundamental here, where we have to, as a Western world and the countries and nations that believe in democracy and rule of law and human rights, come together in confronting, violations of international law, violations of territorial integrity and sovereignty of sovereign states, violations of human rights. And I think really in the next few years, we have a golden opportunity to become closer, not more apart with the United States, and also to fight this isolationism culture in the US that Elise has been talking about through the example, not through disengaging, but through engaging, because otherwise we will not convince Americans to be committed to European security. And there, I would just like to remind the good old Benjamin Franklin, who was the first American diplomat to Europe, who was a US ambassador to France, and who signed the US and French treaty in the building of current Sciences Po in Paris. And he was saying once that, we should stick together or we will be hanged separately. And I think this is the moment now where the Western world has to stick together, and Europe, while being more resilient and more sovereign indeed, and more capable to act, should strengthen the alliances and not weaken them.
Thank you, Mr. McAllister.
First of all, I very much agree with what Arnoldas was just talking about. I would like to make two final concluding remarks. The first one is strategic autonomy, or whatever you want to call our baby, is not limited to security and defense. Strategic autonomy applies to a wide range of issues, including trade, finance, and investments. Whereas in trade, luckily the European Union is strategically autonomous. When it comes to finance and investment, work remains to be done. Especially, we need to develop the international role of the euro to avoid being forced to break our own laws under the weight of secondary sanctions. So that's one point I wanted to make. And the second point is about the strategic autonomy and the transatlantic link. My impression is that EU-NATO cooperation has improved, and it has seriously improved since the Warsaw and Brussels declarations of 2016 and 2018. I think we have reached an new unprecedented level. And I would like to also thank NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who, from my point of view, is very present also in the European institutions here in Brussels. In the end, if we want to become more capable and thus more autonomous as Europeans, this also means that we have to work meaningfully with any US administration. And that's why I believe it would also be in the American interest to strengthen the European pillar within NATO, or as a US senator once told me, look, what we expect from you Europeans is to do more, to spend more, and to talk less. And a final point, because I have very much sympathy for our Baltic partners. If you look at the NATO forward presence in the Baltics and Poland, out of the 4 lead nations, 3 are not in the European Union: the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, and only the 4th lead nation in Lithuania, Germany, is a member of the European Union. And this once again shows us that yes, we need to improve European defense and security cooperation, but we have to be crystal clear. We have a huge own interest to maintain the closest possible relations with loyal allies like the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. And there can be absolutely no discussion in my country that there's any kind of form of equal distance between Washington, China, Beijing, or Moscow. We can be thankful that we are at the side of our American partners. And whatever we do, and that is my only real main message, whatever we do, it is never, ever going to be about undermining our strong NATO alliance, the alliance which guarantees peace, security, and freedom in this part of the world.
Thank you, Mr. McAllister, and thank you all for fascinating conversation and insights. I think we all thoroughly enjoyed it, and thank you for those who have asked questions. The last sentence goes to, obviously, the organizer, Ms. Elisabeth Bauer.
Thank you very much. And Mr. McAllister, it's very hard after your last sentence, because I think that was wrapping up everything what we are discussing. But one idea you gave in as well, that we might even have to discuss some other things of strategic autonomy as well. But in the first place, as you might imagine, the Baltic countries, the defense and security part is one of the most interesting part for these countries over here. But what we can see as well out of the discussion, it doesn't matter where we have got, whether we have got some different points in some special aspects. But one thing which we even, with one sentence which was used during the pandemic all over, was stronger together. And I think this is even meant with NATO and EU. In this case, thanks all of you, thanks all the audience who stayed up with us for the long time. And you will be able to have the videos seen. We will be on our YouTube channel. Everybody will get the link to the YouTube channel as soon as it is done. And thank you for being with us. And Niklas Helvig put his publication from the Finnish Institute for International Affairs in the chat. So if you want to have a look on the latest publication of them on strategic autonomy, please have a look on that. Thank you all of us, and thank you for being with us, and see you sometime again. And thanks especially to our guests from France, Germany, Brussels, and from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania. And thank you, Linas, for moderating it. Thanks. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.